Hello, welcome to UrAkedmi. At UrAkedmi today we would be dealing with a poem by Emily Dickinson titled I Taste Liquor Never Brewed. Emily Dickinson is an American poet. She was born in 1830 and she died in 1886. In the contemporary times, Emily Dickinson is considered as one of the most famous poets from America. An important feature of her life was that she lived most of her life in isolation. If we go through the poetry of Emily Dickinson, we find such elements in her poetry. She was an introvert type of a person who hesitated to come in front of strangers, to come in front of guests, and her communication with her friends, with her relatives, with others is supposed to have been only through correspondence. At a very young age, Emily Dickinson developed a habit of isolating herself, and she also developed a habit of putting on white clothes. So it is believed that in most of her life she would wear white clothes only, and she renunciated life. She never married. She dedicated most of her life in writing poetry. However, during her lifetime, she didn't publish many poems. It was only after her death that her poems would get published. It is also believed that Emily Dickinson wrote around 1800 poems. However, we do not have 1800 surviving poems of Dickinson, but still we have quite a large number of poems written by Emily Dickinson, which survive even today. Emily Dickinson was not a conventional poet. She would not write the way Americans were writing poetry at that time. In those days, when Emily Dickinson was writing poetry, the Americans were very strict regarding the rules of poetry, regarding the conventions of poetry. It was very difficult to find the publication of poetry in America back then, which would be different or unconventional. Despite that, Emily Dickinson would write very unconventional poetry. Her poetry would be characterized with short poems without titles, unnecessary capitalizations, dashes, unnecessary punctuation. You would find words which have been put in inverted commas which do not need to be put inverted commas. You will find that she would put dashes between her lines in her verses, which were not usually required, but then she does all such kinds of things, so which make her very unconventional poet. She also does not use, for example, iambic pentameter. She would use ballad rhyme throughout her poetry, which a ballad rhyme is a type of a rhyme wherein we have 4 lines and they alternate between iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter, and that is how she would write her poetry. She was very obsessed with death and immorality. Most of her poems would be dedicated to death and to immorality. These two would be most resounding, most dominant themes of the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Emily Dickinson is said to be an eccentric. She can be said to be a transcendental writer. It is also believed that Emily Dickinson was introduced to William Wordsworth, and William Wordsworth had gifted her with a collection of poetry of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and who continued to be a great influence upon Emily Dickinson. In today's lecture, we would be dealing with a poem by Emily Dickinson titled I Taste Liquor Never Berwed. I Taste Liquor Never Berwed was published in 1861. To be precise, on 5th of May 1861. And this poem was published in Springfield Daily Republican. And they also titled this poem, and the poem was titled probably The May Wine. However, Emily Dickinson never titled this poem, and when it was published later in a collection of Emily Dickinson's poetry in 1955, it did not contain the title which Springfield Daily Republican would put. Mostly this poem is known with its first line, "I taste liquor never brewed." This is also a very short poem. It also follows the ballad rhyme, which generally most of the poetry of Emily Dickinson would be. It deals with renunciation. It deals metaphorically with intoxication, with drunkenness, but that intoxication and drunkenness would not be in real sense, but it would be in intoxication with maybe death, intoxication with afterlife, intoxication with God. These would be some of the focus points of this poem. Now in the next section we would be dealing with the text of the poem, and then we will analyze this poem in detail. Now that was about Emily Dickinson and the poem with which we are dealing today.